So it's an honor to have author Joseph Lelyveld back here with us tonight at Politics and Prose to talk about his new book, His Final Battle, The Last Months of Franklin Roosevelt. In his final 16 months of life, President Franklin Roosevelt oversaw the D-Day invasion, the Manhattan Project, and attended the Yalta Conference. This was all after receiving a diagnosis of severe hypertension and congestive heart failure. In this compassionate account of those final months, Mr. Lelyveld details our 32nd president's decisions given these difficult public circumstances and private life-altering considerations. A review in the Washington Post said of the book, psychologically intense, pinning down FDR's innermost thoughts is always an elusive goal for a scholar, but Lelyveld has the fortitude and skill to properly analyze FDR's decision-making process. What makes his final battle so exceptional is the author's admirable ability to write nonfiction with highly stylized lyrical beauty. Joseph Lelyveld spent nearly 4 decades as a reporter and editor at the New York Times and was an executive editor there from 1994 to 2001. He's the author of several other books, including Great Soul, Mahatma Gandhi and His Struggle with India, and Omaha Blues, A Memory Loop. An earlier book on apartheid, Move Your Shadow, South Africa, Black and White, won the Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction in 1986. So please join me in welcoming Joseph Lelyveld to Politics and Prose.
Thanks very much. It wouldn't be a book tour if you didn't get to Politics and Prose. And, I think on each of those previous books, I did get to Politics and Prose. I feel that there's some kind of stamp of legitimacy by being here. I don't really have an answer to the question I'm most often asked about this book on Roosevelt, how I got to this subject in the first place. The awkward truth is I can't remember. That you millennials might not understand, but that happens at my age. At some point, 4 or 5 years ago, after my previous book on Gandhi came out, I read something that pointed me to this very different, not conspicuously spiritual figure. It wasn't a book. It may have been just a paragraph or a sentence somewhere in an article. Whatever it was, it started me thinking and poking around in libraries, reading old newspaper microfilm, and eventually led me to the FDR Presidential Library at Hyde Park. Only gradually in this process did I think I was working on a book. I was led on by my curiosity, and what I was really curious about was FDR's own thinking about the question of his own mortality, the ultimate existential question. What was it that led our longest serving president, kept him going after all these years of stress in the midst of the most destructive war in human history? Was it his sense of duty or self-sacrifice, or was he, as we sometimes now say on this sensitive topic, in denial, as it's fair to say most of us are day in, day out? Not to be morbid, there was one small fact, I guess, in all of this that I have to own up to, and I was already, when I started thinking about FDR, years older than he was at the end of his life. He was just 63 on the day he died, April 12, 1945. That's now 71 years ago. If I'm old enough to remember that day, you can do the arithmetic and work it out. But I remember that day the way most of us remember November 22nd, 1963, and all of us, I presume, remember September 11th, 2001. On that long ago April day, I was listening to my afternoon radio serials. I think it was Captain Midnight. And it was interrupted by the fateful bulletin from Warm Springs, Georgia. This was how they did things before social media. A deep, disembodied voice came out of a box. It said, We interrupt this program to bring you an important news bulletin. President Roosevelt is dead, or words to that effect. I waited for Captain Midnight to resume, and he didn't. There was doleful orchestral music, then more bulletins, and then I went and told my grandma what happened, and she practically dropped her frying pan. Captain Midnight didn't return till the next week. Could be my interest in this subject started there, but I don't really think so. I think I was doing what I've done through a long career as a reporter. I was sensing a story that hadn't been fully told. The time span I cover in my book is ostensibly quite limited. Sometimes I say it's 16 months, sometimes I say it's 17. I count on my fingers. What I was thinking about was starting it more or less, although I don't literally do it that way, with Roosevelt's departure from the White House in November 1943 to go to Tehran to meet Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, from there till the final day in Warm Springs. Obviously, those months can't tell the whole story of his presidency. It's necessary to bend the chronology forward and back to see a bigger picture. For instance, you can't understand Roosevelt's determination, I submit, to engage Stalin face-to-face as he did for the first time at Tehran without referring back to his experience as a young man as a second-tier official in the Woodrow Wilson administration during World War I, which left him with a determination this time around to shape the post-war order as he believed Wilson had failed to do in his day. Even before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt was preoccupied with the question of how this might be accomplished. He had no pat answer. This famously pragmatic leader didn't deal in pat answers. But the question of how he could succeed where Wilson failed was never far from his mind. I think I can personally handle Stalin better than either your Foreign Office or my State Department, he wrote to Churchill early on. Properly handled, the dictator might be the key to victory and the post-war world. It was a proposition to be tested. Tehran was to be the first test. In a way, Roosevelt was like a laboratory scientist with a hypothesis. He was prepared to drop it, but he was going from the thought that failure to achieve some agreement on how the peace would be kept among the great powers when the League of Nations came into being had led by some more or less direct line to World War II. And therefore he had to work on this problem all through the war. He couldn't leave it to the end of the war. And similarly, the chronology has to be bent again. The backstory has to be sketched in if we're to find meaning in the place he made in his crowded life for his old love, Lucy Mercer Rutherford. The high drama inherent in the fact that it was Lucy, not Eleanor, who was with him when he was felled by a hemorrhage on the brain in Warm Springs. Beyond that, my 17 or 16 months are packed with huge events. History with a capital H. The D-Day landings in Normandy, the largest amphibious assault ever and likely to remain so. The decision to proceed with building the atomic bomb. FDR's long postponed announcement that he would stand again for a fourth term in 1944. He held up announcing that till 8 days before the start of the Democratic Convention. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that were reinstituted as a practice? When they told Wendell Willkie, the candidate he defeated in 1940, that Roosevelt was running again, Willkie's response was, "Is that news?" Going on with my list, his stealthy maneuvers to drop his starry-eyed Vice President Henry Wallace from the ticket in favor, finally, of a little-known Missouri senator, a hard-fought campaign at a time when no other Democrat was given even a small chance of winning, followed by the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's big gamble on a counterattack which proved to be virtually the last gasp of the Third Reich. Then the fourth inaugural, followed in 2 days by Roosevelt's long, perilous trip to Yalta on the Black Sea for a second meeting with Stalin and Churchill, leading to agreement on the United Nations, which was now seeming to matter more to Roosevelt than it had earlier, and Soviet intervention on our side in the Pacific War. That's something we hardly think about because it only lasted a week. But that the Russians had a non-aggression pact with the Japanese all through World War II. And only after the surrender of Germany did they negate it. And this was the result of really complicated and prolonged negotiations. There are some historians who think the intervention of the Russians scared the Japanese War Cabinet even more than the atomic bomb. Who knows? And finally, a compromise on Poland that sounded reasonable at the time, but hardly stood a chance, Roosevelt recognized, since Stalin's Red Army had already occupied the country, to mention a few highlights of those months. And here's a sidelight. By picking Truman as his understudy and earlier Dwight Eisenhower to be Supreme Commander in Europe, both surprise choices in their day, FDR, as time would show, chose not only his successor, but his successor's successor. All these matters have been written about at length, over and over. All have given rise to controversies that still can't be deemed settled. But Roosevelt himself tends to recede, to fade out in many of the standard accounts. He was too easily presumed, long after the fact, to have been a dying man, losing his grip on affairs in the midst of all these big events. After all, he did die. Yet somehow he managed to remain a convincing president almost to the end. After he died, there were a lot of people who wrote, "I knew all along he was dying." But if you go back into the journalism and diaries of that day, there were very few people who put that thought down. And if you examine month by month how Roosevelt conducted himself, even when he was very weak, you see that he was still, to a considerable extent, in control of affairs, more than many presidents. Yet his actual medical condition was never disclosed in his lifetime, and his medical records disappeared, were presumably destroyed afterwards. He took care, as he always had, to cover his tracks, and not just when it came to matters medical. When I wrote the book, I thought that this had a lot to do with the White House physician, Surgeon General of the Navy, a man named Ross McIntyre. And I thought that he must have been the one to destroy the records. I still think he was the one to destroy the records. That's fairly obvious. But the thought occurred to me one day when I was giving this talk that, yeah, he probably did, but like everything else he did, he was probably doing it on orders from Roosevelt. Hard to tell, but we'll never know. This was the most private of public men, charming, loquacious, but also exceedingly guarded to the point of making Hillary Clinton seem, by contrast, a font of self-revelation. He kept no diary, forbade the taking of minutes at his meetings, met the press regularly, but almost always in that pre-television age, on an off-the-record basis. The very few who were thought to have been his intimates and confidants got only peeks into his thinking, which is all you could expect, considering that his thinking was in a constant state of flux and revision, never static, as situations and the political climate changed. His wife said something that I've come to think of as very profound, but it takes some thinking about to get her meaning. The president doesn't think, Eleanor once said. He decides. And I won't venture to say what I think that means, but basically, Roosevelt was always had three or four or more considerations on his mind, and lots of rationalizations for going in this direction or that. And he didn't decide until and he had goals, but he didn't decide where to go until he saw a path to actually accomplishing what he hoped to achieve. So it was changing all the time. It was in flux. Dedicated to keeping his political, diplomatic, and personal options open as long as he could stand on all sides of an issue when it suited his purpose. Highly principled in his aims, he was routinely duplicitous in his tactics. A juggler, Roosevelt himself said, ready to lie if it would help win the war. The British military historian John Keegan called him by far the most enigmatic leading figure of World War II. I prefer the word inscrutable. Comes to the same thing, I guess. It applies on the political home front, too. In the same few days, in July 1944, he simultaneously led a pair of would-be candidates to be his running mate, for would-be candidates for vice president, to believe that each had his support for the nomination, while working all the while to block them, on behalf of a third man to whom he never directly talked. Henry Wallace, who was one of the two, the other was James Burns, aptly called him a waterman, capable of looking in one direction while rowing in another. In these wartime months, his instinct for secrecy, could be rationalized as a matter of national security. Under a supposedly voluntary censorship agreement with reporters covering the White House and the news organizations they represented, the actual whereabouts of the president was treated as a state secret, not just when he traveled abroad to Casablanca or Tehran or Yalta, but also in the United States. He was actually away from the White House in these months I'm talking about, more than in it. Congress, the public at large, and cabinet members often didn't know where he was. He made 21 trips of varying length to Hyde Park in those 17 months on a presidential train that departed late at night from the basement of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing across the mall from the White House, riding in his own special outfitted armor-plated railway car called the Ferdinand Magellan, which now, by the way, if you're going to Miami, can be visited at an installation called the Gold Coast Railway Museum, which sits right outside the Miami Zoo. And you learn a lot about Franklin Roosevelt by walking through that car. He thought nothing of spending a whole week in that car without leaving it. And that to him gave him a sense of freedom that being in the Oval Office did not. Because in the Oval Office, everybody was coming at him, making demands, and crippled the way he was, he just couldn't. It was hard for him to leave. In the railway car, he was generally quite there with a few people, and the world was passing outside the windows, and he felt liberated. In April 1944, as D-Day approached, he spent a month in what can reasonably be called rehab at a plantation in the South Carolina Low Country. All that time, the closest the New York Times came to disclosing his whereabouts and condition was to say in a subordinate clause of an inconspicuous article on an inconspicuous page below the fold on the left-hand side, that he was somewhere in the South. A line in David Herbert Donald's biography of Abraham Lincoln helped inspire me finally to give this elusive subject a shot. He said it had been his ambition to produce a biography from Lincoln's point of view, using information and ideas available to him, seeking to explain rather than to judge. After some months of intermittent exploration, I concluded with a reporter's opportunism that there was ample room, despite all that had been written about FDR, for such a book on him. The opening was there in part because some of the most dedicated and industrious Roosevelt biographers and scholars never got to the end of his life. Arthur Schlesinger's Age of Roosevelt was still in the 1930s after 3 volumes when it ended. Kenneth Davis died after his first 3 volumes. He still had at least 1 to go. Frank Friedel, the earliest scholar to plan a multi-volume treatment, started a 5th but left it unfinished. Meanwhile, new information and insights surfaced over the years. There were the clinical notes Roosevelt's cardiologist, a New York specialist named Howard Bruin, eventually published in a medical journal 25 years after his patient died. There was a letter Frank Leahy, a noted surgeon who was a consultant on the case, left for posterity, a note dictated a day before FDR declared for a 4th term. It said he wouldn't be able to survive it. That note later came into the possession of the Leahy Clinic, which is now a major medical center north of Boston, and there was a prolonged battle over whether it could be published, with the Franklin Roosevelt Archive Library on one side, backed by the National Archive, and the Leahy Clinic on the other, arguing that it would be a violation of patient confidentiality. Finally, the highest court in Massachusetts ruled in favor of the archive. The Leahy letter didn't come into the public domain in full until 2007. Most helpful were the Daisy Suckley diaries. Now, Daisy was a Hudson Valley neighbor and distant cousin, some say 6th cousin, who spent more time during the war alone with the president than anyone else, including his wife. Daisy then survived him by nearly half a century, always insisting that she had saved no notes or correspondence or any paper of interest. After she died in 1991 in her 100th year, a leather valise was hauled from under her bed in her dilapidated mansion near Rhinebeck, New York. Inside was her diary, which Jeffrey Ward then edited into a volume aptly titled Closest Companion. Read in conjunction with the day-by-day official White House logs, which told who was supposed to tell, they didn't always, who Roosevelt saw at what hour in what order. Now online at the FDR Library's website, the Suckley Diary supplies the mood music for the president's last months, a kind of up-and-down recitative in which his hopes, worries, and calculations find telling, highly variable expression. It's not that he poured out his heart to Daisy, but he would just say things. He'd utter several sentences about how he was feeling or what he thought he should do, and she would take it all down, day by day. These and similar late discovery, he had absolute confidence that if he said things to her, it would remain private, which proved to be true for 6 decades or so. These and similar late discoveries now made it possible to adopt Professor Donald's standard and attempt a book about this climactic period of his life and presidency from Roosevelt's point of view, seeking to explain his thinking rather than to judge it or him. In simplest terms, to tell his story. In reviewing the choices with which he was confronted through his eyes, or I should say attempting to view the choices through his eyes, it became clear to me that they didn't really present themselves to him as choices. At the end of 1943, on his return from Tehran, he appeared to be in radiant good health, or as well as he could be with his crippling infirmity. 3 months later, his Navy cardiologist diagnosed him with congestive heart failure, a diagnosis that then wasn't revealed for 26 years. A couple of things to be said about that. One is that congestive heart failure today is something that can be treated. and people can live for 10, 15 years after having experienced it. But in Roosevelt's time, there was very little that could be done beyond monitoring diet and activity. The second thing to say about that was on my mind, and I've now forgotten it. That the timeline here really matters. A lot of the writing about Roosevelt at the end of his life assumes that he was in just steady, constant decline. The fact that when he returned from Tehran, he was feeling vigorous, felt he had accomplished something, thought he saw a way forward, not a sure way forward, but a possible way forward, influenced his thinking and activities early in the year. And it's in that period when the Democratic National Committee started thinking about whether he would run again. And he wouldn't tell them yes, but he didn't tell them no, which they took to be a yes, hopefully. So by the time he begins to realize that he may be in trouble, and historians have spent a lot of time wondering about whether he realized it, which seems to me a kind of silly line of reasoning to go down, since he was inhabiting his own body, and he knew that things were getting harder for him every day. He asked for a coffee mug instead of a coffee cup because his hand trembled. He knew that he sometimes dozed off while dictating letters. These were not secrets that could be kept from him. And he knew that he was being examined every day after that by a cardiologist who once or twice a day would give him an EKG. An EKG in those days, if you can remember, lasted 10 minutes or so. Today it's over in about 40 seconds. This was not a dim man, I think, and the Suckley Diaries make clear that he was well aware of all of this. At one time, he may have wondered whether an early end to the war in Europe might give him an opportunity to bow out, but that consummation didn't come soon enough. Given those interlocking timetables for the invasion and the convention, did I say that or did I interrupt myself? Well, what I meant to say is that at the time he had this dire medical examination and dire prognosis. D-Day was 2 months old. The invasion was 2 months away. The convention was 6 weeks after that. It wasn't an easy time to get out. So given those interlocking timetables, he was in no position to look for an exit or a successor. He couldn't conceivably say on the eve of D-Day, "I'm out of here." Carrying on was a more obvious choice than getting out. He told himself and a few others that he could always resign if it got to be too much. A couple of vignettes stick in my mind when I consider Franklin Roosevelt's valor in these months. One is a visit he paid in the wards of a naval hospital in the hills above Honolulu, to which amputees and other grievously wounded survivors of the assault on the island of Saipan had just been delivered. Roosevelt, who never allowed himself to be photographed in public in his everyday conveyance, his wheelchair, had the Secret Service wheel him through those wards from bed to bed so the wounded airmen could draw courage from the example of a commander-in-chief who hadn't been able to take a step unassisted for nearly a quarter of a century. Theirs was a kind of a communion. The other image also involves his wheelchair. The day after he returned from Yalta, arriving at the Capitol to address Congress for what would prove to be the final time, he had himself wheeled down the aisle and transferred to an armchair from which he spoke in a seated position at the foot of the podium where he'd previously stood, explaining without a hint of self-pity, it makes it a lot easier not to have to carry 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs. This was the first and only public acknowledgement in those 12-plus presidential years of his infirmity. Frances Perkins, the first woman to occupy a cabinet office, and she had known Roosevelt both before the onset of polio and all the years since, called it one more spiritual inner victory for him in his long adjustment. A staunchly anti-Roosevelt columnist in the New York Daily News, he was named John O'Donnell, and the New York Daily News was then the nation's biggest circulation paper, wrote that these are O'Donnell's words, wrote that even his grimmest political foes were stirred by the crippled president's brisk allusion to what had previously been unmentionable. It reawakened, he said, their honest appreciation of the undoubted personal courage and fighting heart of the man who was about to tell them what he had done in the name of the Republic. It blew away some of the fumes of personal bitterness. Applause swept the chamber from both sides of the aisle. I'll end with an obvious thought, too obvious perhaps, but unavoidable, I think, in this dismal season. We don't hear such great grace notes from political enemies in our own era, you may have noticed. Maybe before next January 20th, Mitch McConnell or the likes of Sean Hannity will have something halfway or a quarter way decent to say about Barack Obama. But don't bet on it. Thank you. Okay.
Are we no. Oh. Thank you very much for your talk today. I'm very much enjoying reading your biography of Roosevelt, and I also very much enjoyed reading your biography of Gandhi. I'm just curious, do you know if Roosevelt at any time had any interaction with Gandhi? And do you and also, do you know what Roosevelt's opinions were about the independence movement in India?
I know that Gandhi wrote a letter to Mrs. Roosevelt, and he wrote some letters in the 30s to Hitler and possibly to Roosevelt about the need to avoid war. They were, by any standard, bizarre letters, because he plainly didn't have a grip on what was going on in Europe, and I don't clearly remember the details of them. What was the second part of that? About India.
Do you know
about the continuation of colonial rule in India.
Do you know what Roosevelt's thoughts were about colonial rule in India?
Yes, very much so. Roosevelt was quite an anti-colonialist. Part of his enthusiasm for creating a United Nations system was that you could build a trusteeship system and take these territories away from the colonial powers and put them on a path to independence and self-government. And it was something he talked to Stalin about. It was something he talked to Churchill about only once, when Churchill was staying at the White House. And Churchill flipped out. And he said he said that if anything like that is ever said to him again, he will resign as prime minister immediately, because he's fighting to protect the empire and not just the British Isles.
Every once in a while, someone will say, well, Roosevelt was in poor health at Yalta, and he gave away this and gave away that to Stalin, et cetera, et cetera. Do you get into that whole issue in your book? And
sure.
What would you tell us about?
I'm not an expert on Yalta, but I think I have some grip on what happened there. He was in poor health. In fact, the case can be made that the trip to Yalta was so draining that it hastened his death. It was a very arduous trip. not just the long sea voyage that he could deal with, but the flight then into Central Asia and the long car journeys on roads, 6-7 hour car journeys on roads that had been chewed up during the Nazi occupation and the fighting there. And he did all of that. But he had what he gave away was basically Poland, which was already gone, and he had been pressing he had been pressing, I would say, even more than Churchill, for some resolution of some kind of decent compromise between the nationalist Poles and the Russians over border issues and over who would actually control the country, and there were some difficult negotiations at Yalta, and I think fundamentally all he got from the Russians at Yalta on this was, one, an agreement to keep talking, two, a change in the language with which they would express their mutual understanding of what the future of Poland was, and basically, in the first version, the Russians weren't conceding anything, and the second version, they began to talk about how they had reached agreement on a democratic solution for Poland, and the great powers were going to sponsor a democratic solution for Poland, and Roosevelt, I think, made a decision at Yalta that he had gotten all he could. He had gotten a lot of other things on the UN and on the Soviet participation in the Pacific, which, as I mentioned, we forget about today. But he felt there was nothing would be gained by going further. Now, he wasn't planning to die in a month after Yalta, and so I don't think he was giving up on it. But the fact is, in 2 weeks before the Yalta conference, I think it's 2 weeks, the Red Army completed its occupation of the whole of Poland. So, and our nearest forces were hundreds of miles away, just entering the Ruhr in Western Germany. There was nobody was saying at that time that we should we should continue on past Berlin and fight the Russians in Poland, and it's hard to recreate the frame of reference of that time. Roosevelt was trying to come out of the war with a positive story, not just a spin, but a positive story to tell the American people that this war had been for a virtuous purpose, and that there was a possibility that we would now accomplish some kind of peaceful world order in consultation with our allies. And he was very disappointed on the Polish side of the thing in Yalta, and didn't try to rationalize it, but he wanted language that said that there was some obligation on the part of the Russians to turn the situation around. He got language. It was a very subtle game, a kind of chess match that he and Stalin played over that, and most of the American delegation thought that it had been a great victory, but it's clear that Roosevelt understood it had not been a great victory. He said on a couple of occasions that he felt that he got as much as he could get. And so there are two schools of thought on this. There is the idea that Roosevelt was a dying man who was duped by a lot of communists in his delegation and caved into the Russians. George W. Bush said something like that at one point in his presidency. But the other school of thought is with the scholars who have studied it. And there are 5 or 6 really solid books on the Yalta Conference, and all of them maintain that Roosevelt, despite his poor health, was alert throughout the conference, and attended all the sessions, and argued his corner forcefully, and was effective at Yalta. The one man who's the best witness, it seems to me, was Chip Bolin, a famous diplomat from the past, who was there as Roosevelt's interpreter, more interpreter than advisor. But he, both at Tehran and Yalta, Bolin interpreted every conversation Roosevelt ever had with Stalin. And they had private conversations, I guess, about 10 or a dozen times, and then all the meetings, the hours and hours of meetings and banquets. And Bolin's conclusion was that our president was a sick man at Yalta, but he was always alert and always effective.
Thank you.
In light of the friendship between Churchill and Roosevelt and the professed admiration that Churchill had for Roosevelt, why do you think Churchill decided not to attend the funeral in Hyde Park?
Well, I think there are one possible answer is he was already past 70. He'd gone through years of stress. He didn't feel up to flying in a propeller plane. This is before the age of jets, for a weekend visit to Washington. I don't find that fully convincing. The British did send a plane. Anthony Eden, the foreign minister, was on it. Churchill could have been on it. I think he felt bruised by his treatment from Roosevelt in the previous year or year and a half, basically the period I'm writing about here. If you follow their correspondence on a whole range of issues, while they said loving things to each other almost every step of the way, it was becoming clear that Churchill felt very bruised. Britain entered the war as a great international power. At the end of the war, it felt that it had slipped to the status of a junior partner in the alliance. And although they were supposedly equals, the Americans were increasingly taking unilateral decisions and that the British had to swallow, not just on military strategy and the post-war colonial fate of the colonies, but on smaller things like, they may not be small to those who are negotiating them, but in the light of what was on the table, airline rights, who gets to fly where in the post-war world. And the long, difficult negotiations were going on. The Americans were demanding that they be allowed to land at various airports in the British Empire when peace was restored, from which they'd been barred. You had to fly there on British planes, and there's one letter from Churchill to Roosevelt that is almost poignant, where he says, "Look, you have all the gold, you have the most powerful navy in the world. We just want to retain our airline rights." Is that too much to ask? And Roosevelt writes back a very gracious letter that says, thanks him for being so frank, says he fully understands him, and yes, it is too much to ask, because not in those words, but he says the future has to be based on reasonable principles, and I think there's one quote from a British official who I think was the leading diplomat who was nominally the advisor to the king, said, "I'm not sure Winston thinks he likes Roosevelt anymore."
Thank you.
I'm intrigued by two aspects of Roosevelt's selection of Harry Truman. One is, it appears to be a casual, almost spontaneous, not very well thought through decision. And is that true? And secondly, once having made the decision and knowing that he was a very ill man, why did he keep Truman out of the loop about the atomic bomb and so much else?
This is, I think, about the 10th of these kind of sessions I've been to since I started going around for the book, and I was waiting for that question because it's always asked, and it's a good question. It's not clear when Roosevelt settled on Truman. It was a sort of process of elimination. My reasoning, which some people may argue with, is I find it very clear that Roosevelt wanted Henry Wallace off the ticket. He liked Henry Wallace, agreed with him on a number of political issues, but felt he was not an effective politician and didn't think he would be a successful president. Although he had gone to the limit to get him on the ticket in 1940. He basically told the convention he wouldn't run with anyone else after he'd been nominated. Like it or lump it was his attitude then. He wasn't prepared to do anything like that again for Wallace. At the same time, he didn't want to hurt Wallace's feelings. So he told him, of course, he wanted him on the ticket. Then he thought that the person most qualified to be his successor was Jimmy Burns, who people called in those days the assistant president, because he was fundamentally running the domestic side of the administration, but Burns, a former member of the Supreme Court, a former senator, was from South Carolina, and the racial issue loomed very large, and the labor unions were opposed to him, and it would be a difficult nomination to put across. Not impossible, but difficult. Roosevelt had a feeling about Truman. He had Truman, he thought, was a stable man who was a good politician from everything he knew. He didn't know Truman well, but there's some testimony that Roosevelt manipulated the thing for Truman, and certainly did in the final days of discussion. It's a tangled story, but it shows Roosevelt at his most duplicitous and brilliant, I think. Brilliant. I think Truman first came to mind when Roosevelt was worrying about how the peace accords would get through the Senate, because he had it so in his mind that Wilson failed to get the peace accords through the Senate 25 years earlier. And so he wasn't going to have Wilson's failure. He needed somebody there to represent him. And he knew it couldn't be Henry Wallace, who had almost no influence in the Senate there, although he had been presiding over it for 4 years. And coming back from Tehran, he apparently told Harry Hopkins that Truman would be a useful person to have there at that time. So he was on his mind. But I think after he eliminated Wallace and he eliminated Burns, and he toyed with the idea of Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, who had never been in politics, of all the real politicians who were plausible, Truman, who hadn't sought the job, was the one who appealed to him the most. It's a long and complicated game he played, and a lot of people say he did it casually and he wasn't paying attention. I think the record makes it very clear he was more into this than any of the party bosses who to whom he was speaking.
And the other part of the
Oh,
question.
the question, the atomic bomb. Well, first of all, in the history of the vice presidency, no vice president had any influence on things like national security issues. No vice president had sat in the White House to that time. No vice president had been confided in on such matters by a president. The vice president was somebody who hung out at the Capitol and was caricatured famously in a Gershwin musical, Of the I Sing, by a character named Alexander Throttlebottom. So if he had done that, he would have been the first president to do it. Now, after the war, when people recognized all these difficulties, these problems in the way our system works, when the National Security Council was established, they put the vice president on it. There was no such thing during World War II. He had no statutory reason to be confided in. The second thing is, in the first few months of Roosevelt's fourth term, he didn't live out for 3 months. In those 80 days or whatever it was, Truman and Roosevelt were in the same place only 21 days. They were in Washington only 21 days at the same time. In those 21 days, they saw each other 2 or 3 times, never privately. And there's no indication that Roosevelt meant to confide in Truman, but it can be argued that he hardly had an opportunity to. I think the simple answer is he should have. If he had done it, it would have broken the precedents. But it didn't occur to him because, as I said before, he wasn't planning to die.
Thank you.
I think we've got one more question over here. We'll make this our last.
Okay. Excuse me. Well before Yalta and the occupation of Poland, it was fairly obvious that the Red Army was going to sweep into Eastern Europe and was going to occupy a lot of territory. And if people knew Stalin at all, they knew that the Red Army, or at least the regimes that followed it, would be very difficult to dislodge and might even be antipathetic to the United States. Is there any evidence that Roosevelt saw this, and did he try to do anything to head it off? I'm not sure what he could have done, but did he try anything?
He tried to somehow get in a position to influence Stalin, to be able to deal with him on matters like that. And they had considerable correspondence over the fate of the city of Lvov, now called Lviv, which is a major city in eastern Poland. And the question, but it had been in various times under Russian domination, under Polish domination, and Roosevelt thought maybe if he could get Stalin to give up this one city as a symbolic gesture to the Poles, he could begin to work out some kind of arrangement. I think he had a pretty good idea how difficult things could be, but he was working with what he had. Nobody has had a clear idea of what he should have done. And you have to remember, until D-Day, which is only June of '44, the Russians had done, to an extraordinary degree, most of the fighting in the war.
It's true.
And before D-Day, all the American forces were confined to the boot of Italy and Sicily, and were making their way slowly up the peninsula. And we were giving Lend-Lease aid to the Russians. I think Roosevelt hoped that relationship could be nurtured to some degree not that where it would become easy and democracy would flourish in in Eastern Europe, but it would become somehow reasonable and and not dark and oppressive.
But he was nervous, if not worried about.
He was more than nervous. He focused on it, and he dealt with Stalin on it, and he had his candidate for who should lead Poland, and I can't pronounce the man's name, but Mikulacik or something like that. It took a lot of his attention, but I'm not prepared to argue that the outcome would have been any better had Roosevelt not died, because it was getting very tense at the time he died. But the Russians made some agreements that they broke, and getting them to make those agreements had not been easy, and Roosevelt pursued the matter.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh.